Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lesson 10-1, Conservatives Reshape Politics. Today, we're going to be looking at Part 1 of a two-part lesson on this reshaping effort that happens largely because of the efforts of this man right here, President Ronald Reagan, but then leads to a conservative revolution that continues through the presidencies of George Bush Sr., William Jefferson Clinton, and a man we'll address separately, George Bush Sr.'s son, George Bush Jr., George W. Bush. But we'll get to him later. Today, let's focus on the conservative revolution of these three presidencies. It begins with Ronald Reagan, the Gipper, this guy right here. Ronald Reagan was a conservative who believed in shrinking the size and power of the federal government, wanted the federal government to be much smaller, much weaker, wanted states to have more of the power. His famous statement, which he gave very early on, was that government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. He's a firm believer in the ability of the American people to solve their own problems. And if government would just get out of the way, the people would learn that they have this ability. But because of government help, the people failed to look for their own solutions. Now, during the Reagan presidency, we run tremendously large budget deficits. We're spending way more money than we're bringing in. But the economic problems of the 1970s fade and disappear. The economy does recover because of this tremendous government spending. Kind of funny that a man who wanted small government would run large deficits, but he did. All right, Reagan's goals. One of his biggest goals were lower taxes, dropping the tax rate for all Americans. He believed that if taxes were lower, people would be able to save more money. They would build up those savings accounts. And as those savings accounts grew, banks would then be able to loan that money to more businesses. And if banks can loan to more businesses, more loans, more businesses, expands productivity, businesses become more effective, and reduce the costs of their goods. So Americans have to spend less money. So we save more and spend less. This approach to economics is called supply-side economics. Costs go down, unemployment goes down, savings increase, and America as a whole benefits from these lower taxes. Supply-side economics. He also believed in deregulation. Reagan greatly reduced the restrictions on how businesses operate, and businesses are now allowed to grow with less government interference. An example might be wetland protections. If you've got a natural swampy area, okay, that's a natural area, and with government regulation, you might limit the amount of business construction that can go on around that swamp, limit the amount of pollution that can leach into that swamp. Those are regulations, restrictions on businesses. Reagan takes those away. If you want to bulldoze the swamp, bulldoze sections of the swamp. We can't quite go that far with his deregulation, but larger areas of the swamp are allowed to be covered over or relocated, and more pollution is allowed to leak into that swamp. And in return, the business sees higher profits, costs go down, employment goes up, and America's standard of living increases. The swamp suffers. Another idea was fewer government programs. He wanted to reduce the role of the federal government. So he cut a lot of government programs, including those that supported affirmative action. That's a civil rights issue that's trying to get more jobs for African Americans, Hispanics, basically non-whites. And also cut programs that supported environmental issues. Got the federal government out of the business of civil rights and the environment. He also wanted a more conservative Supreme Court. Ronald Reagan appointed 3 conservative justices to the United States Supreme Court during his presidency. Antonin Scalia, right here, who's kind of one of the most important conservative justices in American history. He passed away a few years ago, but his impact is still felt on the court today. There's also Anthony Kennedy, who is, by most considerations, the most powerful member of the Supreme Court today. His decision on most issues winds up being the decision of the court. Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice, was a conservative when she was appointed, but as America as a whole became more conservative, she actually came to be seen as a more moderate, even borderline liberal member of the court. As she would say, not because her views changed, but because America changed. This says Scalia and Kennedy are still members of the court today. This was written before Scalia passed away. Kennedy is the only remaining Reagan appointee. Reagan was also known for a tough anti-communist stand. He opposed communism, and to fight communism, he greatly increased military spending. This is where most of the budget deficit comes from. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev takes over the Soviet Union, the USSR, and he wants to end the arms race. He wants to stop building nuclear weapons entirely. The Soviet economy is on the point of collapse. They can't afford the arms race anymore. So they go to Reagan to try to stop this arms race. And they come to an agreement. They agreed to stop the construction of what are called medium-range nuclear missiles in the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. They're still short range and still long range, but this is a step toward the denuclearization, getting rid of the medium-range missiles. Also, another effort of Reagan's came in Central America. Reagan supported government and rebel groups in Central America that are fighting against communists, particularly in El Salvador and Nicaragua. To raise money for this, members of the Reagan administration will sell money to the nation of Iran. Now, keep in mind, Iran has just been involved in the hostage-taking of Americans at the embassy. So America and Iran are not exactly on the best of terms. But Reagan can't get money to fund these wars in Central America through other means. And he gets that through the selling of these weapons. This later becomes known, and it becomes known as the IranContra affair. It gets Reagan into a little bit of trouble. Now, despite that trouble, Ronald Reagan is still remembered in history as a mostly successful president. Many will see him as one of our most successful presidents. The man to take over after him is George H.W. Bush. Bush's presidency winds up being entirely occupied with foreign affairs. Bush has almost no time to focus on domestic issues during his presidency. That's because the world sees a tremendous change in 1989 when the Soviet Union, America's enemy in the Cold War, begins to collapse. The Cold War is ending. The Soviet Union is crumbling. Eastern European nations, the puppet governments there, the ones that were communist and established as communist right after World War II, they say, no, we're done. Communism is not working for us. We're out. Peace, dude. And they leave. And the Soviet Union starts to break apart. In August of 1991, Boris Yeltsin, who is a reform leader in Russia, who also wants to end communism and wants to bring about free market reforms, stands up to Soviet leaders who are trying to forcefully, using the military, regain control. And he kind of famously steps in front of the leaders and says, no. And the Soviets back down. And by December of that year, every nation, including Russia, had withdrawn from the Soviet Union. December of 1991, the Soviet Union no longer exists. And this all goes down during Bush's presidency. To add additional distraction, the Cold War is over. So there's power vacuums throughout the world. Who's going to be in charge? Who's the boss? Who's overseeing what we do? One nation in 1990 decided that they would take advantage of this international struggle. The nation of Iraq invades their neighbor Kuwait to take over the oil fields in that oil-rich nation. Now, the United States, seeing their role in the world now as the world police, steps up and leads a coalition of 39 other nations, 40 in all, to help liberate Kuwait. Now, this mostly winds up being a U.S. effort, but they do so. And in the Persian Gulf War, the United States goes to war against Iraq and frees Kuwait. But all this effort and all this focus on foreign policy, making sure that the world would be safe through the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was, good job, Bush, like legit, and making sure that Iraq knew that it couldn't invade its neighbors to steal their stuff, and defeating Iraq, again, nice job, Bush, that was good. But while he was doing this, the domestic economy was suffering. Unemployment was increasing, and Bush lost popularity and lost re-election. We wind up with our third president of this rise of conservatism. Now, Mr. Samuelson, you might say, Bill Clinton was a Democrat. He's not a conservative. Well, Bill Clinton was a Democrat, but he was a part of this new breed of Democrats, these new moderate Democrats. Bill Clinton was not a progressive or a liberal. He's very much a moderate. And beginning with Clinton, we see a shift in the Democratic Party away from truly progressive policies. Bill Clinton focuses on the economy and economic issues, typically a Republican area. He approves NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is going to increase business profits, but somewhat at the cost of labor, not usually a Democratic issue. Now, he does go after some Democratic progressive issues, including healthcare. He tries to pass a national healthcare law, but he meets so much opposition, really from both political parties, that he has to back down. And partly as a result of this backing down, Republicans take control of Congress in 1994, and it becomes an extremely conservative Republican Congress. Clinton and Congress largely disagreed on the role of government, moderate Democrat and conservative Congress. And in 1995, Congress failed to approve Clinton's budget proposals. They had a major government shutdown. All non-essential government agencies were closed. Now, the compromise was eventually reached, and the two sides found an area where they could work together, welfare reform. But their working relationship was strained, and they would not see eye to eye on most issues going forward. Now, Clinton will win a second term. The people still liked Clinton. They liked these moderate policies. But Clinton's own personal life then became a serious distraction to his ability to govern. During an investigation, it appeared that President Clinton had lied under oath. This lie was in regard to an extramarital affair that he had had. President Clinton had been involved in a relationship with somebody who was not his wife, and in an official investigation had lied about it. Now, Republican opponents in the House of Representatives said, aha, the President of the United States has broken the law. He cannot serve as president, and they impeach the President of the United States. That is, they open an official trial to see if he should be removed from office. Only the second time in U.S. history that this had happened. It didn't even happen to President Nixon. Well, Nixon resigned. It would have happened to Nixon. Now, Clinton gets investigated, and ultimately the Senate decides to acquit him. That is, if he did do something wrong, and the evidence was a little fuzzy there because of the language used, even so, it's not enough to kick somebody out of office to lie about an affair that they had. That's really a personal issue. Well, Clinton dodged a bullet on that one. But during this impeachment, Clinton also had to deal with foreign events. Events in Yugoslavia were getting really bad. One group, the Kosovars, wanted to create an independent country, a separate country within Yugoslavia. And another group, the Serbs, who were the dominant group within Yugoslavia, attacked to stop them. And to make sure that the Kosovars would not ever be able to advocate for independence again, the Serbs went about killing their opponents. Largely, the biggest opponents of them were the ethnic Albanians within their country. Massive genocide within that country. Now, in March of 1999, NATO responds to that. They start bombing the Serbians to keep them out of Kosovo, to keep that army from marching into the other region. And in June, NATO withdrew, and the UN took over the governing of the region. There would be no more Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia gets divided up into 6 nations to then prevent future fighting. Yugoslavia was this large, formerly communist nation on the Adriatic Sea across from Italy, and it is now these 6 different nations today: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, and Macedonia. All right. Well, that is all that I've got for you today. Let me just go back and make sure that that was true. Yep, that's true. I hope that you learned something. Come back again and see me next time. Farewell.